Hi, Govanen. Welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek. And though Tolkien was famous for filling out an enormous amount of detail in the various worlds, well, the world that he created, but the various stories within that world, he left a lot of things rather up to mystery. One of the most famous examples of this, of course, is Tom Bombadil, and people have theorized about Tom Bombadil for a long time. So what I want to do in this video is talk about some of the things that Tolkien refers to in The Lord of the Rings that we really know virtually nothing about. They get named, we might get a very brief description, but substantively, we don't really know anything about any of these things. So the nature of this list, of course, is rather odd because there's not much to talk about with any of them, and also, without combing through the entire novel, I can't necessarily come up with a complete list, so if I leave anything out, do make sure to mention them in the comments. That caveat out of the way, let's get started. So one of the earlier things that gets mentioned in the story, not in the movie at all, but is definitely in the book one whole time, is the Forsaken Inn. And if you're wondering, what is that? That's the same thing I wonder every time I come across it again in the text, because what happens is the hobbits have met Strider at Bree. They're on their way to Weathertop, and the hobbits are kind of asking about, what's our plan here? How long is the road? And Aragorn mentions, the road is kind of weird. It's not really exactly clear how long it is. Nobody's ever measured it, and everybody's happy to reach their destination once they get there. But in the course of kind of describing the length of the road, he mentions, it's a day's march east of Bree before you get to the Forsaken Inn, and from there, and that's like the only mention of the Forsaken Inn we get. And the name, of course, is what makes it so mysterious. Why is it called the Forsaken Inn? You get this image of a rather creepy building, probably standing alone on the highway from Bree to Rivendell, with nothing else around it, and that you probably would never want to walk into, and if you did, you might not ever come out again. That's all we know. And so you always have to wonder, like, why is there this inn called the Forsaken Inn? Who, in their right mind, with any business sense, would name their inn that? Or did it acquire that name by reputation? There's bound to be a story behind this, and so you have to wonder what that story might have been if Tolkien had ever gotten around to really putting some thought into it. As it is, it's a name, and that's all we get. Speaking of Aragorn, there's some incidents in his past that we know nothing about, and there's a lot of stuff in Aragorn's past that we don't know much about. We know he served the Steward of Gondor before it was Denethor. We know he served Theoden's father Thingol in Rohan. We know he did a lot of traveling and a lot of stuff, but there are certain things that we get mentions of that we never really learn anything about. We know, for instance, that he tells at one point that he went into the east and to the south where the stars are strange. We don't know anything about those journeys, but the one that I think is the most interesting that he mentions is when they're debating whether or not to go to the mines of Moria. And here again, the book is very different from the movie. The movie acts like this is Gimli's idea and Gandalf doesn't want to go. Gandalf in the book wants to go. Aragorn doesn't. He thinks it's a bad idea. And Gandalf basically says, well, we've both been in and we've both come out again. And Aragorn says, yes, but the memory was evil. Did they go in together? Were they, did they both go in at separate times? We don't really know. We don't get a whole lot of information about any of this. And what is it about Aragorn's memory that's so evil about it? Like, did he encounter something there? Or was there just this sense of a brooding presence that he really didn't like but never encountered? What exactly was Aragorn's experience in Moria? And what was Gandalf's prior experience in Moria? The only thing we know about Gandalf's prior experience in Moria is that he went the opposite direction. Because when they're asking him, well, how'd you get in the first time if you can't open it this time? He's like, well, duh, I came in from the east and exited this way because from this direction you could just push the doors out. It's no problem. It's only getting back in that you have to know the password. So that's the only thing we know about Gandalf's prior trip. And presumably both of these trips were before Balin led his expedition to try to reclaim Moria and the disaster that followed from that. So, presumably there was no Balrog that awoke. I mean, the Balrog was probably down in there somewhere, but just didn't, if they had known the Balrog was there, neither of them maybe would have wanted to go into Moria. But, both of them are debating this, and they've both been in it before. Gandalf thinks it's a good idea, Aragorn doesn't, and it's because he's had experience with it. But we don't know anything about that experience. Speaking of other experiences Aragorn has had that we don't really know anything about, it would appear that he at one point encountered the Nazgul rather directly, which is in of itself pretty interesting because, well, in the conversation he has with Frodo and the other hobbits at the inn at Bree, he ends up in the course of the conversation basically saying, describing them a little bit and saying they are terrible. And it basically says, like, he has this pained look on his face, he goes pale, he's clenching the arms of the chair that he's sitting in, and then he finally relaxes and, like, wipes his brow, and he's like, there, perhaps I know more about these things than you do. Clearly he does. I mean, the reaction he has implies that he has come into very close proximity to the Nazgul at some point. The interesting thing about this, of course, is the fact that the Nazgul have not been terribly active for most of the last 87 years, which is when Aragorn would have been alive. And to the extent that they have been, they have never crossed the river. So we have to assume probably his only real connection with the Nazgul that he could have encountered them before would have been while he was serving Denethor's father, Ecthelion, possibly in the attack on Umbar and the Corsairs. Maybe, maybe not. We don't really know. But one way or the other, Aragorn has encountered them before, and he doesn't seem very willing to talk about the encounter, but it certainly seems to have left him with a, let's just say, a rather chill attitude towards repeating the adventure. Couple more characters that we know nothing about. Well, Gothmog is a name that readers of the Silmarillion would be familiar with. He was the Lord of the Balrogs. But there's also a character in the Lord of the Rings named Gothmog, and he is basically said to be the lieutenant of Morgul. And he takes over the Battle of the Pelennor Fields after the Witch King is defeated by Éowyn. And that's pretty much all we get about him. Is he a man? Is he an orc? Is he... I mean, we really don't know anything about him. I mean, it just names him and says he's the lieutenant of Morgul and says he takes over. We don't know anything about him, but the fact that he gets a name and the fact that he's named after the Lord of the Balrogs from the First Age, it's kind of interesting in and of itself. And of course, that's not the only First Age connection in the battle, because of course, the giant battering ram they used to attack the main gate of Minas Tirith is named after Morgoth's own hammer, Grond. So there's a lot of throwback information here, and it makes you wonder, who this person is. Is this like one of those weird, not really a completely natural being? Is this, maybe a lesser Maya that's involved? Is it just some man who happens to be, high up in the rankings, or is it an orc that happens to be high up in the rankings? You don't really get the idea. Too many orcs do a whole lot of leading because they're not super good at it. You have orc captains within their own, groups or whatever, but you don't get the idea that they tend to be leaders of whole armies. That doesn't seem to happen much. On the other hand, is Gothmog maybe one of the other Nazgul? Is that why he's the lieutenant of Morgul? Maybe, maybe not. We really don't know. All we get's the name. And then the other character that we don't know much about is the Mouth of Sauron. Here, of course, we know that it's not a Nazgul, and we do get a brief lesson on him in about one paragraph worth of text before the Black Gate. And it basically tells us that he's a Black Númenórean, that he learned sorcery from Sauron and rose to be the lieutenant of Barad-dûr, and that's about it. We don't know where he came from, although if he's a Black Númenórean, that seems to make it probable that he was from the Umbar region, because that's where a lot of the Black Númenóreans ended up after, the Second Age. Black Númenóreans, just in case you're not familiar, are Númenóreans who were in Middle-earth, but who served Sauron. So when Sauron went to Númenor and kind of corrupted the entire culture, they were the ones that followed him, as opposed to being among the faithful who followed Elendil and his sons Isildur and Anarion. So there are these Númenóreans who were in Middle-earth who were bad, and then there's the Númenóreans with Elendil who come to Middle-earth fleeing the destruction of Númenor who are good, and they have their wars with Gondor and Arnor over time, mainly Gondor because they're mostly in the south, and they end up in Umbar, and Gondor takes Umbar at one point, it gets retaken, there's a lot of history there, but that, seems to be mostly where the Black Númenóreans are, holding out, is in that region of Umbar and that part of Harad. And so you get that little bit of information about who he might be, and that's really all we get. In fact, the text goes out of its way to tell us he had forgotten his own name. He didn't even know his own real name anymore, which is interesting because only really an omniscient third-party narrator would even know that. The theory behind the whole text is the idea that Frodo wrote most of it with some input from, Pippin and Merry and some stuff they got from Gondor and that sort of thing. But if that's the case, how does anybody know that he had forgotten his own name? Seems kind of interesting. Very unique information we get there that might point to some interesting things that maybe come in somehow later on, but we really don't get any clue what that might be. Since we're hanging out around Mordor, we might as well discuss the land of Mordor itself. And here what's interesting is not so much the Mordor that we know of in the Third Age, that we kind of know enough about. The Númenóreans that, were part of that formed the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor, conquered it and explored it pretty thoroughly. But what's more interesting is, what was Mordor like before Sauron came there? We really don't know. We know that there's a volcano there. Did he start the volcano, or was it always a volcanic wasteland? We don't know for sure, because the only thing that we do know about Sauron pre-Third Age is what little we learn about him in The Lord of the Rings, and that's mostly in the Council of Elrond, and in the section in the Silmarillion titled of the Rings of Power in the Third Age. And there we learn that Sauron escaped from the destruction of the First Age, kind of hid out in Middle-earth for a while, eventually revealed himself sort of and tried to get the elves to kind of fall for his ploy of being friendly, and he holed up in Mordor for a fortress. But before that, we don't know if he was already in Mordor, what he was doing there, and we certainly don't know what was going on in Mordor in the First Age, because that was, during the First Age, Sauron was off on the main frontier in the First Age Wars, so he wasn't even over in Mordor. So you really have to wonder, did he create the wasteland that is Mordor, or was it always just terrible and that's why he picked it, because it just really suited his evil? But we really don't know. We know that there is a part of Mordor around the lake of Nurn, or Nurnen, I forget which now, in the south, where that's where all the crop growing happens that feeds the armies of Mordor. We get that little brief reference somewhere in the Return of the King, when Frodo and Sam are basically wondering, how does he feed his orcs? How can anybody survive in this wasteland? And it tells us a little bit as an aside, there's this one fertile region. So that may suggest that other areas were fertile as well at one point, and that it was only Sauron's evil and his workings with the mountain of fire that made it completely a blasted wasteland elsewhere, or it might have just always been a blasted wasteland elsewhere. The whole thing's surrounded by mountains, so it's, you could see that going either way. But regardless, we don't know much of anything about what Mordor was like prior to Sauron coming there. Another historical thing that we know very little about is what men in the Second Age were doing. We know a little bit about what the elves were doing in the Second Age, because we get in the Unfinished Tales a lot of stuff about Celeborn and Galadriel, what they were doing. We know what, the Noldoran kingdom of Eregion was doing, because they were mostly interacting with Sauron, learning how to make rings and making everybody's lives worse, unfortunately. But men mostly get left out of this picture. Tolkien did start a story called Tal Elmar, and it's in one of the History of Middle-earth volumes, and I'm going to do a video on that at some point. And it's about a man who encounters Númenóreans when they come back to Middle-earth, and his adventures, but it doesn't get very far, and so we don't know much of anything about anything beyond the fact that there's men there, and they're not necessarily all that, they're kind of benighted in the sense that they're low technology. They have a fear of a lot of things. They fear the Numenorians. They also fear the power in the east, which presumably is Sauron. But beyond that, we don't know what men were doing. Like in the Third Age, we get a pretty good idea of what a lot of men were doing, because we get references to Gondor and its alliances with the men of the north, who then come down and make the nation of Rohan. We get a lot of stuff like that. But in the Second Age, we don't know almost nothing about men in Middle-earth. The only thing we know about men really is almost entirely about Numenor. So it would be interesting, or would have been interesting, if Tolkien had actually done more of that story and explored more of what the plight of men was like in the Second Age in Middle-earth, which seems maybe to have been the motive for starting that story in the first place. But as I mentioned, unfortunately, you didn't get very far at all with it, and so we just won't ever know. Finally, we do have one reference in The Hobbit that I was recently reminded of in a comment on one of my previous videos that I thought really fit here perfectly well. At one point, when the unexpected party is going on, and the dwarves are kind of talking about what they're going to want Bilbo to do and saying, I don't think he's up to it, he says something about, if you tell me what you want me to do and I'll do it, even if it means going to the last desert and fighting the werewolves. Well, this could be put down to just an expression that might have been common in the Shire, because it, referred to some old legend of, great monsters far, far away. But great legends of monsters far, far away in a world with lots of great monsters with many things that are far, far away very well may contain a kernel of truth. And so Bilbo's offhand remark here might actually be referring to something that at one time, at least, was very real in Middle-earth. So the question is, what would that have been? The topic, I think, came up because in one of my videos about the Hobbit movies, they were referring to the giant worms that come in the third movie, the Battle of Five Armies, and connecting the two. And that's certainly interesting as a connection. But what I find more interesting is the idea that Bilbo calls them wereworms. Werewolf, wereworms, the idea of were is it's the Old English word for man. So it's a man-worm, which makes it seem a little different probably than the giant tunneling worms that we see in the movies. So you have to wonder, what did Tolkien even have in mind when he wrote that? Like, just visually, what was he imagining when he wrote that down? And then secondarily, did he think of that as something that was actually out there, and that there was a last desert that you could encounter if you went far enough into the east? Who knows? But, and that's part of the reason it's on this list. But of course, like I said, it could just be an expression. It could be something that doesn't really refer to anything meaningful, but we never get that explained. So I like to think that there might have actually been something like that way off in the east, and that we just don't know what it is, or why it's important, or how in the world the Shire folk came to even know of such things. So that's my list of stuff from The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, since I tacked on The Hobbit there at the end, that are basically unknown quantities, things we don't know anything about, history, places, people that we don't know anything about. As I mentioned earlier, do mention in the comments below if you can think of something else from the text that we don't really ever get any explanation of, because that would be really cool to go through some more items like this. But in the meantime, if you did enjoy the video, please do give it a thumbs up and share it around. You can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore for some occasional Tolkien-related trivia questions, and you can subscribe to the channel here. Don't forget to click the bell icon. You can support the channel here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.